I'm here with Nicholas Turner, president of the Vera Institute of Justice. The Institute has long been at the forefront of criminal justice reform across the United States and is distinctly focused on securing equal justice, ending mass incarceration, and strengthening families and communities through expanding access to healthcare, keeping minors out of prisons, and the elimination of inmates in exile from their loved ones during incarceration. Mr. Turner has worked with the Institute for 16 years and has been chiefly responsible for a myriad of initiatives, including Vera's state sentencing and corrections initiative, Vera's domestic violence projects, and the creation of its youth justice program. Mr. Turner, thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today. Before we get started, is there anything you want to add?
No, Jordan, thank you very much. I'm glad to be part of this discussion with you.
Fantastic. So New York City is currently experiencing a significant rise in crime. Through the end of 2020, murders were up 41% over 2019 and 53% over 2018. Shooting victims were up 103% over 2019 and 109% over 2018. What explains this dramatic rise in violent crime during the pandemic?
Jordan, it's a great question. If I could, let me set a little bit of context because it's important to understand. Both of the phenomena that you talked about, the increase in homicides and increase in shootings, are significant, and we should be concerned about them. But there's also been a fair amount of hyperbole and attaching these phenomena to as consequences of certain things that is just factually incorrect. So the one thing that I'll begin by talking about is that, we should understand the increases in the last 2 years as being substantial increases, but while violence, homicides, and shootings in New York has actually been at a historic low. So if you look from the mid 1990s until about now, homicide is down over 80%. Shootings are down a similar number, and almost all of the classes of crime are down significantly. So we've seen a huge reduction in crime in this city for the past 30 years, and it's in that context that we've seen the upsurge in shooting and homicide. But sometimes people say that's the highest point in the history of the city. That's simply not true. It is something to be concerned about, however. The answer to your question is actually a really tough one. There are all sorts of explanations. Obviously, the one that is staring us in the face is the impact of the pandemic. And I think if you think about the disparate impact of the hardships of the pandemic, death, sickness, loss of jobs, loss of incomes, those have typically been in Black and brown communities. So imagine what it's like to be in a community where and in almost all of the households you have seen a huge loss of income, people in food lines, the stress that comes with mass death, and so the combination of hardship, loss of income, disruption, loss of hope that I think everyone in this city has felt over the past year has different impacts in different places. So I think that's part of it. There have been other concerns about the retreat of police after the death of George Floyd and the protests, that police took a step back. That's a theory as well. I think one theory that really has not been supported by the data that we've heard some people talk about is that reforms that were put in place in the previous year or so, reforms dramatically reducing the use of money bail as a way to keep people in jail. A number of public officials said that was what was spurring the increase in shootings and homicides, and the data does not support that at all. So there's a lot of debate about it. At the end of the day, we don't really know, but I think that the two things that I talked about are probably the predominant forces.
Okay, well, I'm really glad you actually brought up the retreat, or the possible retreat, of the NYPD and the discussion around the reforms implemented last year, because we are going to get to both of those things. But before we do, given the rise in violent crime relative to 2018, there has been some discussion and some debate on whether now is the right time to focus on reform or on bringing that level of crime back down. So what's your take on that? Which should we be prioritizing, if either?
Well, I think that it's important to do both. That question presupposes that you can't address violence through any other means than using the tools that we've used for decades. Aggressive policing and aggressive use of incarceration. However, there's a pretty substantial literature and experience that public safety is delivered through other means. So investment in civic institutions, investment in violence interruption. Cure violence is an initiative that seeks to. It's not a law enforcement driven initiative, but an initiative that seeks to have credible messengers intervene when violence starts to arise in communities, it's a public health approach. So I think that the answer is really both and. It's how do we think about how to provide true community safety through means that aren't just totally reliant on law enforcement being the answer. I think what we have learned from decades of law enforcement being the answer is that it undermines individual and family and community stability and opportunity. It further increases the distress of communities. And we need to be thinking broadly about what the other strategies are to reduce violence. And so we know that some of them exist. So I think you can still answer the question saying, well, what is a limited role for police, but what else do we need to be investing in smartly in order to reduce violence that might be occurring in neighborhoods? And that the answers are there.
Right. So we shouldn't be treating the two as mutually exclusive. It should be a joint effort using reforms and using building up communities that will then subsequently bring that crime. Definitely.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
As part of that initiative, the NYC Council and the NY State Legislature have reduced offenses for what are called public order crimes, right? So things like public urination, public drinking, these all are no longer being prosecuted. And even something like turnstile jumping is now being called a crime of poverty, according to DA Cy Vance. So based on your answer to the previous question, I'm assuming these initiatives are helping to reduce criminal activity and kind of rebuild these fractured communities that have become broken due to aggressive policing and over-enforcement of these crimes.
I think that's right. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to understand about the policing in this city, but in America generally speaking, is that there's been a tendency towards over-criminalization, over-enforcement, and using arrest and enforcement, I'll describe it as the harmful hand of law enforcement to address almost everything. So I'll give you a national statistic that provides an example. So every year in this country, there are about 10.6 million arrests. And when you break them down, when you just aggregate them, what you see is that 80% of those arrests are for crimes that are related to homelessness, substance use, and mental health disorder. And only 5% of the arrests are for violent crimes. So we have the police responding to a lot of things. And what we've seen that's happened actually in New York City over the past few years is that arrests have, as you said, they've dropped, both felony and misdemeanor arrests. The use of criminal summonses have dropped. The use of stop and frisk has dropped. And so we're seeing, sort of a retreat from the conventional American law enforcement response. And we were seeing that in the context where we were also seeing crime continue to go down, homicides and shootings that we just talked about being an exception to that. And so it is important to think about how the police can more surgically respond to things that they ought to be responding to, violent crime in some cases, but staying out of conduct that that doesn't require two cops with sidearms in a car to address. If you think about the death of Eric Garner in 2014, everyone remembers him saying, I can't breathe when he was wrestled to the ground. But one of the first things that he said was like, why are you always stopping me? Why are you always on me? And what did the cops who approached him, interdict him for? Because he was selling loosies. He was alleged to be selling single cigarettes. So we criminalize a lot of conduct and ask the police to intervene on things that they shouldn't be intervening on. I think the trend in New York is starting to get better, and we need to continue to see that.
Absolutely. And as part of that trend, the current NYPD Commissioner, Dermot Shea, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, disbanded all undercover units, which were part of stop and frisk and which were a really big part of the city's aggressive policing policy, especially following things like 9/11. Do you feel that that move, the disbanding of undercover cops, is fundamentally a good thing and is leading to a reduction in crime overall?
Yeah, well, I think that's right. What Jordan, what you're responding to is, or what you're talking about, is the disbanding of the street crimes unit,
Yeah,
which was sort of like the jump out unit that was often responsible for for shootings of unarmed people and for a disproportionate level of violence. And I think that was proper, but I think what a lot of people are also asking for now is, and it gets back to that figure that I shared with you around the 10.5 million arrests every year in this country, is who is better suited to respond to an issue of homelessness or to someone who might be having a mental health breakdown on the street? Why do we call the cops? Why are we not investing in response teams that are trained in behavioral health? Why do we have police in schools as opposed to having other modes of discipline? And so there's a bigger conversation that's not just about, well, let's get this sort of hyper aggressive street crimes unit off the street. But when we think about all of the activity that the police are engaged in, can we identify better positioned actors to respond to the conduct that is of concern? And I think the definitive answer to that is yes. And we're starting to see that in New York. We're starting to see it in a lot of other cities around the country where they've taken police. I'll give you one example. So, Charlottesville, Virginia, has taken the police out of schools. Oakland and Berkeley, California, have taken police out of traffic enforcement. There's no need to have folks with sidearms doing either of those things. So you're onto a very important point about sort of reducing the jurisdiction and being clear that when we are asking for the police to respond to something, that they're really the appropriate first responders.
Yeah, they're good for some things, but it's not a blanket solution. It shouldn't be just about, the NYPD, not just one body, but we really should be looking at what bodies are actually qualified to deal with.
And it's a really hard thing frankly, it's a hard thing for the public to sort of get their heads around, because we've been so conditioned to believe that the only way you deliver public safety is by calling 911 and asking the police to come, and they pull up with their sirens on. But in fact, we know that there are better positioned responders, and that we're asking the police to do too much things that they have not been well trained for.
One thing that's interesting within this conversation is some minority communities and some presidents within those communities are actually expressing fear over where this might lead, right? So Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams has complained that his constituents aren't getting the police response that not only he feels they deserve, but that they've also requested. So does this conversation, which is ultimately a needed and good one, does this have the potential to disproportionately impact minority neighborhoods in a negative way?
Well, I think it's one of those things where it is possible that both things are true, that we rely upon the police to do too much, and that oftentimes police underserve predominantly Black and brown communities, and underserve them in a variety of ways, are slow in their response time, are underserve them in terms of courtesy and respect and relationship that you would expect of an entity that is there to protect and serve. And so that the interactions tend to be negative and impersonal and feel like an occupying force. again, I think that there's a tendency to sort of quickly go to this argument. Well, people in Brownsville are complaining about shootings, are complaining about homicides, and therefore it makes no sense at all to think about reforming the way the police enforce in that neighborhood. And I think that that's skipping a bunch of steps.
Yeah.
What the right set of steps that you want to take is, okay, well, we hear those concerns about the need for service and response from government. What are the right range of responses? Well, should the police be responding in some things? Yes. Should we have more of an investment in violence interruption, which is not a law enforcement, interaction? Yes. Should we have more investment in things that help communities to thrive? Summer jobs for kids, stable housing, street lights, things of that nature? Yes. Should the police not be the responders for things when someone is decompensating or when someone needs to find a shelter bed? Yes. So I think that, you want to it's important for us to help people sort of disaggregate and sort of, and not immediately go to the argument, well, if Black and brown folks have said in Brownsville or East New York, whatever, that they're concerned about the violence, that it simply doesn't make sense for us to think about curtailing police response or developing other responses. We have to be more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's become very apparent to me during this conversation, and as I've done my own research, is on both sides, people tend to apply blanket policies and blanket statements when this is a much more nuanced issue, right? So you do have people who are saying we should get rid of all police, it should be a flat, cut to budgets and leave it at that. On the other hand, people say, no, we need this, either the same level or more police. That's the only way to solve crime and what have you. And the reality is this is a much more nuanced, as you put it, a much more sophisticated issue that we have to respond to in a sophisticated way. So I want to get to active reforms a bit, just moving away from police specifically. So both New York City and New York State have instituted a variety of reform measures over the past 5 years. Things like the Right to Know Act, the Youth Engagement Track, Raise the Age Law, shuttering state correctional facilities, etc. These initiatives, at least looking from 2018 to 2020, these initiatives don't seem to have deterred violent crime, right? Granted, that's not their sole focus, but that should be, at least in a lot of people's opinions, one main focus of criminal justice reform is ensuring that crime overall, especially violent crime, goes down. So in your mind, how could these reforms be improved to properly address this new issue?
Well, that's a great question. And in sort of the layperson's mind, we expect that things like long sentences or the likelihood of prison actually, deters conduct on the street, but there's actually very little evidence to support that at all. And so I think we have to look at it in a different way. And so I'll use this example that you're giving. Again, like sometimes people really think about these things as binaries, is that if we reduce the size of the justice system, if we reduce its impact, crime is going, it's like a seesaw.
Yeah.
The justice system is yay big, so then that makes crime go down. If you start to shrink it, there's a concern that crime is going to go up. But one of the things that we are rarely talking about is what is the cost of having that kind of system? Where 10.5 million people are arrested every year, where, the Brennan Center for Justice put out some really interesting and important research that shows that if you are an individual and you have been convicted of a misdemeanor, which is relatively minor conduct, and that maybe about 90% of people who go through the justice system get a misdemeanor conviction, your lifetime earnings expectancy drops by 16%. If you're convicted of a felony, your lifetime earnings potential drops by 22%. And if you've spent some time in jail or prison, your lifetime earnings drop by 51%. So I use all of that to say that what we haven't done in the past is had a very good conversation about not only the relationship between the carceral system and violence and crime, but like what's the cost of the use of the carceral system on individuals who it touches, on the family members who are, robbed of a parent, and what happens to the kids who are growing up or robbed of a wage holder and end up losing their apartment and going into the homelessness system, and this kind of disruption that creates for them, and what does it mean for communities that are depleted. So so I sort of want to push back on the notion of this just being a binary, and say that we need to look at it in a much more with a much more complex lens that really says, even if one were to stipulate that the criminal legal system produces benefits in terms of safety, and I think that there are like real arguments to be had around that. We have to say, well, what are the burdens that that's producing, and do we just rationalize those away? And I think that that's something that too few people have paid attention to.
Yeah, I agree. I also think you're the first person I've heard throughout this fall and the summer talk about the extended impact of merely being incarcerated. And it surprised me because, to me at least, that's one of the more pressing concerns here. The justice system should not be set up in a way where it punishes those who do their time and then their families. That to me seems like a hugely important issue that I haven't really heard people talk about. Most of the discussion has been focused on police and then very immediate criminal justice. So I think that's super interesting.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear you say that. I mean, there's some decent information. I mean, I think it's, in this country, about over 2.5 million kids have an incarcerated parent. It got to be so significant that Sesame Street even created a character to speak to them. And there's a lot of data about the economic burdens that imposes on on the parents and families who are left behind. So we often don't talk about that at all. And I think part of that is that there's been a real stigma associated with it, that people are ashamed of the conduct of a family member, or just don't want to talk about it. And so that private pain never surfaces, and we don't acknowledge it. I think the last thing that I just want to say on this point, Jordan, is that the way the media and public officials tend to talk about these matters is they do tend to oversimplify. I mean, it has always sort of been a story of cops and robbers. The American story is one that this is how you respond to, either disorder in cities, or concern about drugs. Has always been to ratchet up the response. So people are very much conditioned to only see it in that way.
Yeah, I agree. It's really troubling that that's the way we portrayed a much more complex struggle. We've talked a lot about the wave of reform following the killing of George Floyd. I just wanted to get your opinion on something. So Governor Cuomo has signed 10 police reform bills into law, which covered a massive range of different areas, from things to police body cams, disciplinary records of officers, firearms licenses. It's a massive suite of bills. So, simple question first: have these initiatives worked in their principal goal of making police what we want them to be, and not this hyper aggressive, almost military force?
No, too soon to tell.
Right.
But my professional suspicion is that they in and of themselves won't be sufficient. And I guess I'll say that everything that Governor Cuomo has pushed through, and the requirements that localities need to produce, police reforms, all deal with, they operate from a perspective of what I'll describe as institutional reform, that the institution that needs reform is policing, that you can essentially hire better people, train them more effectively, create performance measures that are different, shape culture in a different way, and that when police officer does something wrong, make sure that that misconduct can be handled in a way that previously it hadn't been handled before. So get rid of qualified immunity, or make misconduct records available. All of those things are, so that's about sort of like essentially making the machine better and then establishing some degree of accountability after the fact. The argument that I would make is, and it sort of gets to this argument around defund the police, which I tend to think more about as let's think about divest and invest, is that that we require systemic reform. And so what's the thing that requires systemic reform? It's not just policing, it is a jurisdiction's approach to delivering community safety. And so this brings me back to the thing that as a general rule, what we have asked the police to do is to respond to everything.
Mhm.
Respond to violent crime, yes. Respond to homelessness, yes. Respond to school safety, yes. Respond to people who are having a breakdown or who are substance using. The police need to respond to all of those things. But what we've essentially done is we've overinvested in an entity that has a broader jurisdiction than it needs to, and underinvested in the tools that could be just as effective, if not more effective, less lethal. And those tools are things like, again, public health responses to mental health and substance use, a different approach to making sure that schools are safe, enforcing traffic laws in a different way. So shrinking the jurisdiction of police and investing in other things like what I just talked about, or violence interruption. And that's what Cuomo didn't do. He essentially said, here's the box, the police are the box, this is the thing that needs to be reformed. And I'm basically saying, you got to look at the whole complex. We've overinvested so much. New York City spends $11 billion a year on policing. And if you look at the 75 biggest cities around the country, the average is probably around they're spending 25 to 30% of their annual general funds on policing. That's an incredible amount of money to be spending on policing. And if we think about how we might deploy those resources better, particularly in a post-pandemic period of austerity, then I think we're having a very different conversation about what we need to reform.
Yeah, definitely. It's not about sticking with one machine, but rather we should be building others, ones better suited for the times we're in and the actual problems facing New York. All right, so last question. In a matter of months, we will know our new mayoral administration. They don't take office till January, but for all intents and purposes, come June, we will know who the next mayor is going to be. What would you like their focus to be principally on criminal justice reform? Where should they be primarily concentrating their efforts?
So I think the story of what New York has done, again, people are alarmed about the increase in homicides and shootings for the past 2 years, and we undoubtedly need to get a handle on that. But actually, New York's story is one where we have massively reduced the use of incarceration and massively reduced crime at the same time. So it is sort of the American miracle story. It's quite contrary to what most people think happens. So I think the next mayor needs to continue in that direction, needs to continue to shrink our overuse of police enforcement, shrink our overuse of incarceration, and then needs to think about how to essentially, reimagine would be the first piece that I would say, which is, don't just think about the delivery of public safety as being a law enforcement exercise. Think about it. If you want to create true community public safety, what do you need to invest in? And we've talked about some of those things already. Violence interruption, public health responses. How do we reinvest dollars that we have poured into law enforcement and into corrections into some of those things? And then how do we so reimagine more broadly what the right response is, reinvest, I think are two critical aspects of what the next mayor needs to do. And and then start to think about some common sense things, which is like, how do you really help people to thrive? You know, we have people who come back from prison. The city can be doing much more to help them reintegrate with the necessary skills, with the necessary supports. So thinking about how to help our returning citizens become productive and thriving members of the communities to which they're returning is another important piece.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. I want to pick out one thing you said. You called New York the American miracle story. And I think that's a phenomenal way to end this discussion. So thank you so much. I had a lot of fun talking to you. This was fantastic.
Jordan, thank you. You were great. You're supremely well prepared. And it's a real pleasure talking to you and seeing how well you've studied these issues, and your questions were terrific.
Thank you.